You grab it from the fridge every morning without thinking twice. Spread it on your toast, toss it in your pan, bake it into something your kids love. It's butter, right? Just simple, pure butter. But here's what most Australians don't realize when they're standing in that supermarket aisle, choosing between 10 different brands that all look basically the same. The label says butter. The packaging looks wholesome. Maybe there's even a picture of a happy cow on there. But when you actually read what's inside, when you look past the marketing and the familiar brand names we've trusted for years, something doesn't quite add up. And what I discovered by simply reading the fine print on 10 of the most common butter brands sold across Australia completely changed how I see that dairy section. See, I'm not a food scientist. I'm just someone who started paying attention after my partner kept asking why our butter sometimes spread like plastic, and other times melted like, well, actual butter. That simple question sent me down a rabbit hole that most of us never think to explore. Because we assume butter is butter. We assume that if it's sold in the butter section, if it's called butter on the package, then it must be what we think it is. But Australian food labeling laws allow for something that might surprise you. They allow products that aren't quite butter, not in the traditional sense anyway, to sit right there next to real butter, looking almost identical, sometimes even cheaper. And we buy them thinking we're making the same choice our grandparents made. Let me paint you a picture of what actually happened last month when I stood in my local Coles with 10 different butter brands in my trolley, looking like some sort of butter hoarder. I took them all home, lined them up on my kitchen bench, and started reading. Not just the front labels with the pretty fonts and the farm imagery. I read the ingredients lists, the nutritional panels, the fine print that's usually in a font so small you need your phone torch to see it properly. And that's when things got interesting, because out of those 10 brands, only 3 were what you'd call proper butter. Just cream, maybe some salt, that's it. The other 7? Well, they had ingredients I wasn't expecting. Things that made me wonder why they were there in the first place. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear. This isn't about scaring you or claiming you've been poisoned by your morning toast. It's about understanding what you're actually buying. Because knowledge matters. And in Australia, where we pride ourselves on food standards and quality, we deserve clarity, not clever marketing disguising what's really in the package. The first thing I noticed across most brands that weren't pure butter was vegetable oils. Now, traditional butter is milk fat, a single-ingredient product humans have made for thousands of years, just cream-churned until fat separates from buttermilk. Simple. But adding vegetable oils, canola oil, palm oil, sunflower oil fundamentally changes what that product is. You're creating what's technically called a butter blend or spreadable butter, but the labeling doesn't always make that crystal clear. I found brands sitting on the shelf right next to each other, same price point, same section of the store, but one was pure butter and the other was maybe 60% butter mixed with 40% vegetable oil. And unless you picked both up and read the back, you'd never know the difference from the front of the package. They both say butter. They both show farms and cows and wholesome imagery. But they're not the same product at all. One is a dairy product. The other is a processed blend designed to be cheaper to produce and easier to spread straight from the fridge. Here's where it gets even more interesting. When I started looking at the nutritional panels, comparing pure butter to these blended products, the differences became pretty obvious. The blended versions often had lower saturated fat because they've diluted the milk fat with vegetable oils. Now, some people see lower saturated fat and think that's better, that's healthier. And maybe that's what the manufacturers want you to think. But here's what they don't tell you. When you're buying butter, you're buying it for the milk fat. That's the whole point. If you wanted vegetable oil, you'd buy vegetable oil. It's cheaper. But we buy butter because we want that specific flavor, that specific cooking property, that specific nutritional profile that comes from dairy fat. So when you're paying butter prices for a product that's been cut with cheaper vegetable oils, you're essentially paying a premium for something that's been diluted. It's like buying orange juice and finding out it's 50% orange juice and 50% water, but they're still charging you the full orange juice price. Would you be happy with that? Probably not. Yet, that's essentially what's happening in the butter aisle. And most of us have no idea, because we're not reading those ingredient lists. Then there's the matter of emulsifiers and stabilizers. I found these in 6 out of the 10 brands I checked. Ingredients like soy lecithin, mono and diglycerides, sometimes even preservatives like potassium sorbate. Now, these aren't necessarily dangerous or harmful in the amounts used in food. They're approved additives. But here's my question. Why do they need to be there? Real butter doesn't need emulsifiers. It doesn't need stabilizers. It's stable all on its own. It's been stable for thousands of years without any help from food chemistry. The reason these additives are there is to hold together the mix of milk fat and vegetable oils, to make sure they don't separate in the tub, to give the product a consistent texture, even though it's made from ingredients that wouldn't naturally blend together in that way. It's food engineering. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with food engineering. We do it all the time. But when it's happening in a product we think is simple and traditional, when we're buying something called butter and assuming it's just cream and salt, then we're not making an informed choice. We're making a choice based on incomplete information and clever marketing. I also noticed something about salt content. Pure butter has consistent salt levels in salted varieties. But in these blended products, salt levels varied wildly. Some had way more salt, presumably to mask the vegetable oil flavor. Others had less, maybe targeting health-conscious buyers. The inconsistency reveals these products are being formulated and engineered to hit certain targets, not made traditionally. Now, here's where things genuinely surprised me. Several brands marketing themselves with Australian imagery, farms and pastures and countryside aesthetics, were using imported ingredients. Palm oil from Malaysia, canola oil possibly from Canada, milk solids from New Zealand or Europe depending on season and commodity prices. This is perfectly legal. Manufacturers can source globally without declaring it on the front. That information, if present at all, is buried in fine print. Meanwhile, the package displays Australian flags and local farms, implying a truly local product. Not legally deceptive, but practically misleading. Then I started thinking about why this matters beyond just the principle of knowing what you're buying. And I realized it matters for cooking. It matters for baking. Because butter and butter blends don't behave the same way when you apply heat to them. Real butter has a smoke point of around 175 degrees Celsius. It browns beautifully. It creates that nutty, caramelized flavor that chefs love. It behaves predictably in pastry because the milk fat crystals have specific melting points that create flakiness and structure. But when you introduce vegetable oils into the mix, you change all of that. Different oils have different smoke points. They brown differently. They melt at different temperatures. And if you're following a recipe that was developed using real butter, using measurements and techniques based on how butter behaves, and you substitute in a butter blend without realizing it's not the same thing, your results are going to be different. Your pastry might not be as flaky. Your sautéed vegetables might taste slightly off. Your baked goods might have a different texture. And you'll probably blame yourself, thinking you did something wrong, when actually the issue was the product itself not behaving the way you expected butter to behave. I tested this, by the way. I made 3 identical batches of shortbread. One with pure butter from one of the 3 real butter brands I'd found. One with a 50-50 butter blend, and one with one of the products that was even more heavily blended with vegetable oils. Same recipe, same measurements, same oven temperature, same baking time. The results were noticeably different. The pure butter shortbread had that classic texture, crumbly but not dry, rich flavor, that golden color. The 50-50 blend was okay, but softer, less flavorful, paler. The heavily blended version barely held together and tasted more like a generic biscuit than shortbread. Same recipe, different products, different results. And that's when it really hit me. We're not just talking about reading labels for the sake of being pedantic or difficult. We're talking about getting what we pay for. We're talking about achieving the results we expect when we cook and bake. We're talking about understanding what we're putting in our bodies and in our kids' lunchboxes every single day. Because if you're spreading what you think is butter on your child's toast every morning, but it's actually a blend of milk fat, vegetable oils, emulsifiers, and extra salt, then you're making a different choice than you thought you were making. You might still be okay with that choice once you know what it is, but you should at least know what it is. So which brands, specifically, should you be aware of? Well, I'm not going to name names and create a shopping list for you, partly because formulations change, partly because what's on the shelf in New South Wales might be slightly different from what's in Queensland or Western Australia, and partly because the point isn't to demonize specific companies. The point is to teach you how to spot the difference yourself so you can make informed decisions no matter which supermarket you're in, no matter which brands are on sale that week. What I will tell you is what to look for. First, check the ingredients list. If it says anything other than cream and maybe salt, if there are any oils listed, any emulsifiers, any stabilizers, any preservatives, then you're not looking at pure butter. You're looking at a processed butter product. That doesn't automatically make it bad, but it makes it different, and you should know that difference before you buy it. Second, look at how it's labeled on the front. Does it just say butter, or does it say spreadable butter, butter blend, buttery spread, or something similar? Those qualifiers matter. They're there for a legal reason. They indicate that the product has been altered from traditional butter. If you see those words, you know immediately that you're not getting pure butter. Third, check the country of origin information. If you care about supporting Australian dairy farmers, if you care about local production, if you care about reducing food miles and environmental impact, then you want to see that not just the manufacturing happened in Australia, but that the ingredients are Australian too. Some products are very clear about this, others are deliberately vague. Fourth, look at the price. This is a general rule, not a hard and fast one, but pure butter tends to be more expensive than butter blends. If you see something labeled butter that's significantly cheaper than everything else on the shelf, there's probably a reason for that. It might be on sale, but it also might be because it's been blended with cheaper oils to bring the cost down. Check the ingredients to find out. And finally, trust your senses. Real butter has a specific smell. It has a specific taste. It has a specific texture when it's cold and when it's warm. If you buy something labeled butter and it doesn't smell right, doesn't taste quite right, doesn't melt the way you expect, then read that label again. Your senses are probably telling you something important. Here's the thing that bothers me most about all of this. It's not that these blended products exist. There's probably a market for spreadable butter alternatives. There are probably people who prefer the texture or like the idea of lower saturated fat, even if that's achieved by diluting butter with vegetable oil. That's fine. People should have choices. What bothers me is that those choices aren't always as clear as they should be. The marketing, the packaging, the shelf placement, the labeling, all of it is designed to make you think you're buying traditional butter when you might not be. It's designed to blur the lines, to make you grab the cheaper option without fully understanding why it's cheaper. And in a country like Australia, where we have pretty strict food standards, where we pride ourselves on transparency and consumer protection, this feels like a gap that shouldn't exist. Because most people, and I include myself in this before I started reading labels obsessively, most people just assume that butter is butter. We assume that the government regulations and the supermarket standards and the brand reputations all combine to ensure that what we think we're buying is what we're actually getting. But that assumption isn't always correct. And the only way to protect yourself from that assumption being wrong is to read the labels yourself every single time. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This sounds like a lot of effort. This sounds like obsessing over details that don't really matter. And maybe for some people, it doesn't matter. Maybe you genuinely don't care whether your butter is pure dairy fat or a blend of dairy fat and vegetable oils. Maybe you can't taste the difference. Maybe it doesn't affect your cooking. That's absolutely valid. But for those of you who do care, for those of you who want to know exactly what you're buying, for those of you who want to support Australian dairy farmers, or avoid certain oils, or make sure your baking turns out the way your grandmothers used to, this information matters. And it's information you deserve to have clearly presented, not hidden in tiny print on the back of the package. The other thing I'll say is this. Once you start reading labels in the butter section, you'll probably start reading them everywhere else too. You'll start noticing that the olive oil you thought was Italian is actually a blend of oils from several countries packaged in Italy. You'll notice that the honey that looks Australian might be a mix of local and imported honey. You'll notice that the cheese that seems artisanal is full of additives and preservatives. And this might frustrate you at first. It might make shopping feel like a chore, like you need a chemistry degree just to buy groceries. But eventually, it becomes second nature. Eventually, you develop a mental list of brands you trust, products you've verified, and shopping gets easier again. Except now, you're making genuinely informed choices instead of choices based on marketing and assumptions. So what do you do with this? First, next time you're buying butter, take 30 seconds to read the back. Look at ingredients, compare brands, notice differences in price, ingredients, origin. See if your usual brand is what you thought. You might be surprised, or you might discover you've been buying a blend unknowingly. Either way, you'll know. And knowing beats assuming. Second, if pure butter matters to you, vote with your wallet. Buy brands that are transparent, use simple ingredients, source locally when possible. Support companies that respect your intelligence. If enough Australians demand clarity, manufacturers will respond. They need our money more than we need their blended alternatives. Third, stay curious. Don't assume supermarket products are what you think just because they're familiar. Question things. Read labels. Ask questions when something seems off. That's not paranoid. That's being informed. In an era of complex food production and global supply chains, being an informed consumer is powerful. Because here's the truth. The butter aisle in Australian supermarkets contains a mix of genuine dairy butter and engineered butter products. Some are clearly labeled. Others are less clear. Some are made from Australian ingredients. Others rely heavily on imports. Some are pure cream and salt. Others are complex blends of fats, oils, and additives. And unless you're reading those labels, unless you're looking past the pretty packaging and the wholesome marketing, you probably don't know which is which. But now you do. Now you know what to look for. Now you know why it matters. And that knowledge changes everything the next time you reach for that yellow tub in the dairy section. If understanding what's actually in your food matters to you, if you think more people should know that not all butter is created equal, then this conversation is worth having. Because the more of us who start reading labels, the more of us who demand transparency, the harder it becomes for manufacturers to hide behind vague marketing and clever packaging. We deserve to know what we're buying. We deserve to make informed choices. And honestly, paying attention to what's in that tub of butter is a pretty good place to start.